Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about the sources of discontent in the workplace.
A lot of studies talk about disengagement, while others highlight engagement in the workplace. It's all very confusing.
In this episode, we're not really talking about disengagement or demotivation. We're looking at what happens next, discontent, which can soar to striking levels in some organizations. But what is it that causes that disaffection and its damaging repercussions? What's the story?
It's important to separate work-related problems from wider issues. Employees don't just leave their baggage at the door of the factory or the office. Employees are people, they're citizens.
The root of the problem lies in the way people perceive three things that can cause a lot of anxiety, and which are only amplified by certain managerial and organizational practices. In short, the three seeds of discontent are a lack of meaning, a feeling of powerlessness, and a sense of injustice.
Let's start with the lack of meaning, a problem that's already pretty clear in today's society. Just look at the demonstrations we've seen over the past few years, the crises we're going through, the growing rejection of elites, and the excessive reliance on a capitalist model.
All of that sounds obvious. But how do some companies magnify the problem?
Most people think a company, private or public, is built on a collective undertaking, with everyone contributing to the overall goal in their own way. They also see the company as accountable to society as a whole and not just to its owner.
That's the goal of all CSR policies. Unfortunately, those policies are undermined when employees see a company as beholden to the interests of the owner alone. And to make matters worse, there's sometimes a real disconnect between what the owner wants and what the situation actually allows. A problem often reflected in unrealistic targets that erodes the purpose of the company and the profession in the minds of employees.
It's that disconnect between a view of what a company should stand for and the reality of the situation that creates the kind of cognitive dissonance that breeds discontent.
The second problem is the feeling of powerlessness. In today's society, there's a growing belief that individual and collective efforts are not producing the required results. In the corporate world, that's amplified by the lack of autonomy and the constant, conflicting signals in the workplace.
We've all experienced the joys of matrix organizations in which employees are torn between one supervisor who sees things as black and white, and another who sees everything in shades of gray.
That source of conflict is usually caused by a disconnect between a model or process and the reality of the situation, a situation with which employees are all too familiar because they experience it on a daily basis. It leads to a feeling of powerlessness.
But that doesn't stop people from working. There are lots of folks who continue to give their all despite everything.
Which brings us to the third point, the feeling of injustice. In today's society, there's a growing sense of downgrading, an idea that efforts are not being rewarded, a sense of social injustice.
All of that is amplified in the corporate environment by recognition policies that fall into two main types. Most companies adopt the same methods of compensation, which, as we've seen, focus too much on targets that can sometimes be unrealistic. And then there's the lack of any real non-monetary reward. People who selflessly serve the common good will do so, even without a financial incentive. The trouble is nobody thanks them.
In other words, you're saying their problem is twofold. They'll do something for the good of the collective, even if it's detrimental to their own financial interests. But, to make matters worse, they get no recognition for their efforts.
That fuels a sense of injustice, all the more so because the focus is too often on what people are doing wrong, and too rarely on what they're doing right.
To recap, employee discontent has three undercurrents: a lack of meaning, a feeling of powerlessness, and a sense of injustice. All three extend beyond the boundaries of the company and are amplified in some cases by organizational and managerial practices. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.